The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Yes, good morning, and welcome to the webinar on the habits of financially resilient farmers. Yes, my name is Dan Davidson, and I work with the Illinois Soybean Association. On behalf of the ISA and the Also Advisors Soybean Management website, I want to welcome you to the webinar this morning. Just a few logistics before I do the introduction. So this webinar, if you registered and you're a CCA and submitted your CCA number, you'll get 1 credit in professional development or professional development area. This webinar will be recorded and online, and it will be posted on the Also Advisor. And if you listen to the recorded version of this webinar, you'll have to go back into your CCA account and apply for 1 credit. By yourself. This will be a self-application to your account. So we'll after the presentation is complete, roughly 45-50 minutes, we'll take some questions from the audience, and Gary will answer them. So go to your dashboard over on the right and submit questions, and we'll compile them and take them at the end. So today's webinar is being presented by Dr. Gary Schnitkey, an economist, ag economist at the University of Illinois, pretty well known in Illinois with much of his talks and research and extension work on farm management. And more recently, he was working on a project about the habits of financially resilient farmers that was based on some research work him and his colleagues did, and with some funding by the Illinois Soybean Association. Dr. Schnitkey is going to review that material today and about these habits of financially successful farmers. Again, on behalf of the Illinois Soybean Association, I want to welcome you and thank you for participating in today's webinar. And Gary, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Good morning, and thanks, Dan. Yes, as Dan mentioned, we are going to be going over the habits of financially resilient farmers, and this is research that we did at the University of Illinois. Nick Paulson, Dale Latz, and Dan was very much involved in this as well. And what we were doing was trying to summarize the differences we saw between profitable and less profitable farms. What I'm going to be doing today is going over three topics related to that. First, we're going to show differences from using FBFM data. So our first topic will be using FBFM, which is a Farm Business Farm Management Association. There's 6,000 farms enrolled in FBFM, so we're using data from those farms, which represent about 25% of the acres farmed in Illinois, and we're going to show how profitable farms differ from unprofitable farms in terms of financial performance. That will then lead to the second topic. In the first topic, we identified more profitable farms. Secondly, we went out and surveyed some of the high-profit farms. We went out to their farms and asked them a series of questions and trying to get at their attitudes, production practices, and a lot of things that we didn't have from their financial data, and look at those high profitability farms in more detail. The final topic then is the 7 habits of financially resilient farmers, and what we're doing there is summarizing what we found in the first 2 topics. The 7 habits, and I'll list these here, and we'll come back to these at the end as well, but just to show what those are. 1, innovative but not at the bleeding edge of technology. 2, always evaluating new technologies. 3, returns is important evaluation criteria. 4, cost control is important, and at the same time, cost control is maintained. Number 5, production is maintained at high levels. 6, the right expertise is brought to the farms, and 7, non-price opportunities are sought. Those are our habits, and again, those are the summaries of the main points that we got from the first two topics. So as we're coming down to those 7 topics, and we'll come back to those at the end of this topic, or at the end of this session, again, to summarize the first 2 topics that we're going to cover. We will go over these information in more detail at our 2018 Resilient Farm Roadshow. These are sponsored by Illinois Soybean Association and Illinois, or University of Illinois. You see the 5 dates listed there. This is a 8:15 to noon program, and you can register at the website listed below. You don't have to catch all that information right now. I'll bring that up on the end as well. But that roadshow will go over more of the detail of those 7 habits, and we'll spend quite a bit of time talking about management, cash flow management, and getting the most out of production technologies at those 5 events. But turning first here, our first topic is finding from FBFM data those farms that are more profitable from those that are less profitable. In doing that, we used a return measure called operator and land return. And you see the return measure, and this graph is for Central Illinois farms in McLean County. It would look very much the same no matter where you went in the state, but this shows the graph of this over time from 1995 to 2015 in McLean County. What we did, again, was use this measure, operator and land return, and this would be total revenue, gross revenue, minus non-land cost. So it's important to realize we're looking at this per acre number, and we're going to divide farms based on this per acre number, and it's before land cost. We did that specifically so that we could look at how farms did before paying for their land base. And we'll come back to that point. So and why we did that was, for example, a farm that owns 100% of his land would probably be more profitable than one that rents their land at pretty high cash rents. We wanted to look at those farms that, from a production standpoint, or producing farms from the land, from that acre of land, were more profitable. We again divided by operator and land return for grain farms, and again we did that, and we asked the following 2 questions: are some farms consistently outperforming their peers? And we didn't want a 1-year look at it. We wanted to look at this over time. So in any given year, one farm might have a better profitable return than another farm simply because they got weather or some other event that caused them to have higher yields, or they got 1 year of good prices. We wanted to look at this over time so that a farm had to be profitable over time. We asked this question: are some farms consistently outperforming their peers? The answer to that is yes, and it's amazing that the farms that are profitable tend to be persistently profitable. So that what we did find was that yes, there were farms that were more profitable than their other farms. How are these farms outperforming their peers? And there is, just looking at the financial results, and again, we looked at revenue, prices, yields from a farm FBFM. So this is total farm data, and cost, and they were doing it in all areas. There wasn't one area where you could look at and say that in this area is where the high profitable farms excelled at. They excelled at all of these areas. So we're going to go now and just show those differences and how those happened over time. What we did was we divided farms into groups based on returns from one period, and then looked at how those farms performed over the following period. We divided those farms into 3 groups: high 1/3 profitability, mid 1/3 profitability, low 1/3 profitability. So this was here you see the lines. We divided those for an average period below 4 years, or for the first 4 years, and then followed those farms after that forming those groups during those 4 years. As you can see, the groups that were set up in the first 4 years tended to have higher, on average, had higher profitability than those other groups in the last 4 years. To summarize that a bit more, what we did was we divided those into groups. We did this for central and northern Illinois counties, and we divided those into 3 groups: Champaign, Ford, McLean, Piatt, and then also another group in DeKalb, LaSalle, Lee, and Ogle. We wanted to pick areas that were very small, and we also confined those farms to have the same soil productivity rating. We didn't want those farms to be more profitable because they were in a different area, had different weather events, or had better soils. We did this for two time periods. One was a high and rising returns, and this was from 2010 through 2012. And then we did this again for a low declining period from 2014 to 2016. Again, what we did was form groups from 2010 to 12, and then followed their results into 2014 to 2016. So the same farms that were high profitable in 2010 to 2012, those were the groups that we followed from in 2014 to 2016. Again, we did define these 3 groups in terms of top 1/3 returns, mid 1/3 returns, and low 1/3 returns. As we looked at those groups, and we're gonna primarily focus on central Illinois, and there isn't, we could do looking across the areas, but they don't vary a lot between the groups. Again, we picked those small groups because we wanted the same weather and same soils as much as we could get. Here's how those groups look from 2010 to 2012. And then from 2014 to 2016, and this is the comparison of the top 1/3 group to the mid 1/3 group. So from 2010 to 2012, there was an $88 in revenue. So that revenue would include crop revenue. It would also include crop insurance and government payments. And then we looked at those according to cost categories. Direct cost is fertilizer, seed, chemicals, drying and storage, anything that's directly related to production of the crop. Power cost are those costs related to machinery. Overhead costs are other items include hired labor, interest on non-land debt, and general overhead and general insurance. As you're going down the list from 2010 to 2012, you'll see that there was the top 1/3 farms had $88 a higher revenue, almost the same cost, direct cost. Power costs were lower by $17. Overhead costs were lower by $8. Overall, total costs were lower by $24, and there was a $112 difference in returns. Going to 2014 and 2016, same look at that. Top 1/3 farms had $52 of higher revenue, $6 of lower cost, $10 of lower power cost, $18 of lower overhead cost, and that gave a total of $85 different in returns from 2014 and 2016. Again, this is a comparison of the top 1/3 to mid 1/3. You can look at that graphically, and here's what that would look like. And again, there's a bar from 2010 to 2012, and another bar from 2014 to 2016, revenue differences, and then direct power and overhead cost differences. Between 2010 and 2012, 21% of the difference between the high and 1/3 groups were in cost, and 79% were in terms of revenue. So that would be both yield and price. If we go to the 2014 and 2016 period, 39% of the difference was in terms of cost and 61% in terms of revenue. So you can see here, in both cases, in both areas, cost and revenue, the high 1/3 groups had higher revenue, lower cost. those differences, the cost became more important in the 2014 to 2016 period. Again, that was a period of lower revenue, and then cost management became more important in explaining the differences. This is the high versus mid return group, and this is again for Central Illinois. Here's the difference between the mid and low group. So now we're making a comparison between the average mid 1/3 return group and the low 1/3 return group. If you're looking at those differences, and again, this would be a difference between between revenue and cost between those groups. There is a total of $80 of difference between 2010 and 2012 in operator and land returns. 50% of that was cost, 50% of that was revenue from 2010 to 2012. So of the $80, $40 was cost, $40 was revenue. Go to 2014 and 2016, $76, 76% of it was in cost, 24% of it was in terms of revenue. Again, couple of trends here. Between 2014 and 2016, cost differences became more important. Again, we had lower prices in 2014 and 2016. And if you're looking at the difference between the mid to low groups, cost was much more of a predominant factor in both periods than it was on the high between the high and the mid group. So if we have a lower profitability farmer, one of the first things we probably would tend to focus on is the cost area rather than in the revenue area. Those same things, and again, this was Central Illinois. We divided this up into groups in Central Illinois, Northern Illinois, Southern Illinois. I'm going to primarily focus here today on the Central Illinois group, but just to show you, this is for Northern Illinois, and if you look at it, it's the same sort of thing. These are the high versus mid return groups in Northern Illinois. And again, 2010 to 2012, 2014 to 2016, 25%, 75%. 25% of that was cost in 2010 to 2012, 75% of it was revenue. So in those periods, there's about $110 difference in revenue or returns between the groups. There was about 100 between 2014 and 2016, 80% of it cost, 20% of it revenue. Again, costs have become more important in describing revenue differences in the lower price environment. That's a high versus mid 1/3 group. Looks very similar to the central group. Going down to the mid to low groups in Northern Illinois, 2010 to 2012, 68% was due to cost differences between 2010 and 2012, 32% due to revenue. Going to the 2014 to 2016 period, 81% was due to cost, and 19% of that was due to revenue. So if you're looking at those two groups, very similar in terms of those results, again, between Northern and Central Illinois. And again, 2014 to 2016, costs are becoming more important, explaining the differences between the groups. In terms of yields, and now this is looking at the revenue factor. So we know that revenue was higher on our high 1/3 farms compared to our mid 1/3 groups. It was a combination of two factors: bigger yields on higher return farms. Between 2010 and 2012, corn yields were 14 bushel higher, soybeans 4. 2014 to 2016, 9 bushel and 2 bushel higher on soybeans. They also had higher higher prices. Corn 15 to 20 cents, soybeans 40 to 50 cents, 2010 and 2012. One of the things we found in our survey was that a lot of these farmers were growing non-GMO or seed beans, and that accounted for that difference. 2014 to 2016, the difference were 5 to 10, 10 to 15, less. Again, we had less pricing opportunities, less variability during that 2014 to 2016 period. So if we're looking at cost, here are our cost items that we could break out the direct power overhead area. And now I'm just going to highlight in red those that differed between the two groups. That was seed, fertilizer, machinery depreciation higher, machinery higher, and machinery repair, those items in the red in the power area, and then the overhead area hired labor. Again, we saw the high 1/3 groups having lower cost. So what we saw, which was somewhat interesting is, or very interesting, is that they had higher yields, but at the same time, their seed fertilizer costs weren't any higher, and in fact were lower than the mid 1/3 farms. Same thing with machinery depreciation, higher in repairs, and then hired labor. The other things we looked at, there was a bit of a difference in farm size. Higher return groups did tend to operate more acres, and the difference was 100 to 200 acre differences between the returns groups. So on average higher. We still did find some larger and smaller farmers in all of the size groups, so that wasn't as differentiating as you might expect. We held soil productivity to be the same across all groups, and these farms had close to 50-50 corn-soybean rotation in all those periods. So these farms tended to run 50-50 corn-soybean rotations. Again, some of the takeaways from this was what we saw is some farms did outperform their peers consistently over time, so there are differences in profitability across those farms, and those farms tend to have higher revenue and lower costs. So it's both revenue and cost. And again, the proportion of those changed over time. Revenues were bigger or more important in explaining those differences in the high price period, and now in the lower price period, cost account for the more of the share of the difference. We did focus here when we divided those groups and focused on operator and farmland returns. And a question that we've been asked, and do land costs tend to wash out these differences? In other words, did the high return groups have higher returns and then go out and rent more land and farm more, or pay higher cash rent? And what we find is that no, that isn't the case. Our high 1/3 farms had the same to lower cash rents than the other groups, and also still had a significant portion of their rents and share rents. Again, that wasn't what caused those farms to be in that high profit group, because we looked at this before land costs, but those farms that made the high top returns in terms of producing a crop, did not have higher land costs. So what we saw is that those farms in the high return group had lower land costs. They paid average or lower cash rent, as well as having lower cost and higher revenue. We then did follow-up surveys, and what we did was we went out to some of the farms in our high 1/3 group and did a survey with them, and we asked a lot of questions about production, what they did production-wise, what they did management-wise, and a number of other factors, which I'm going to share with you now. And what we were trying to do was get at a goal of identifying common practices across these more profitable farmers. These follow-up surveys were very small. We did in Central Illinois 9 farms. We spent a good amount of time with all of these farms. We can't say anything statistically from these follow-up surveys, but again, what we were trying to do is see if we could identify anything sort of consistent across these groups that we could not see with just their financial data. Again, this follow-up survey was directed to those individuals that were in the top 1/3 group, so we do know that those individuals had higher returns over this time period. Again, I'm going to focus here on Central Illinois. There's not a lot of difference between the other groups, but let's start, and I'm going to go over that. Some of the areas we addressed in more detail were size, in terms of acres, labor force, tillage practices, planting practices, and growing season practices, harvesting practices, managerial practices, and then attitudinal questions. Again, we were looking at these farms and seeing if we could identify some common characteristics across those farm sizes. So we're going to go through some of these results now, and going size, tillage, planting, growing season, harvest, managerial practices, and the attitudinal. Again, this is a survey of a small subset of those farms. So we can't say anything statistically, but we can look at common characteristics across those. Starting out here with size, we had farms in a wide range of sizes. 5 farms were between 1,000 to 2,499. 3 farms were between 2,500 to 5,000, and 1 farm was over 5,000 acres. We found farms in all groups of all different sizes, by the way. So we, our low 1/3 group did include some farms that were over 5,000 acres, and there were some smaller farms in all 3 groups. So size, while we saw it go up, the top 1/3 farms tended to have larger size than the mid 1/3, 100 to 200 acres. It wasn't something that you could say larger farm was necessarily more profitable than a smaller farm. These farms had 2 farms basically had 1 full-time equivalent. 3 farms had 1 to 2 FTEs, 3 2 to 4, and 1 farm had 4 or more FTEs. Overall, these farms had an average FTE of 1 FTE per 1,500 acres, and this is where we sort of see the break even at. If you need about 1,500 acres per FTE to be sort of in that profitable area. That isn't to say that smaller farms can't meet that. There could be other enterprises on that operation that would cause them not to meet it, but over these farms we saw something sort of in the benchmark of 1 FTE per 1,500 acres. When we looked at tillage on these farms, we saw nothing consistent. So here's the fall tillage. 4 of those farms had conventional tillage, which is less than 30% residue, and this is going into soybeans. 1 reduced tillage, 2 no tillage, and 2 some combination. So we had quite a bit of variability across those farms. Same for fall tillage going into corn. 4 no tillage, 1 conventional tillage, 1 strip tillage, and 3 had some combination. Again, what we saw, and again, there wasn't a common tillage practice. We asked these questions about spring tillage, and you've got the same sort of diversity across these farms. We didn't see anything that was consistent in terms of tillage across those operations. When we asked about planting practices, some of the things that we did see here was that all these were following fairly close to a corn-soybean rotation. They did not vary that rotation much from year to year to year. And again, looking at that time period, you saw some years pre-2014 where corn was much more profitable than soybeans. And here more recently, soybeans have been more profitable than corn. These farms did not vary rotation a lot, stayed pretty consistent there. Main reason given for that was disease and pest control, risk reduction, and they believe that to be the most profitable option. And again, this was for Central Illinois. goal for wanting to start soybean production 4 before corn planting is finished, and 5 waited after corn was finished. Most of these wanted to start planting soybeans by mid to late April. So if anything, these farms were pushing soybean planting early, wanted to get it done by mid to late April. One of the farms, one of the years, planted all their soybeans before corn. If anything, looking at row spacing, we saw a lot of variability in there, but if anything, moving more towards smaller than 30-inch rows. 3 of these farms had separate planters for soybeans. Those planters, by the way, tend to be older. They're older planters, but if anything, what we found when we're looking at those planting practices is pushing towards earlier planting of soybeans. On the planting practices, we didn't see much. Only one of them was using variable rate seeding technology. They were typically seeding from 120 to 150 kernels per acre, and most were 130 to 140. 8 of those had decreased those rates in the last 5 years. 8 were using seed treatments on all the acres, and 1 on the majority of all acres, and all had been doing that for at least 5 years. Again, many of the reasons for the seed treatments were given were better emergence and planting earlier. We asked what they looked at when they were choosing soybean varieties, and we gave them from 1 to 7. Here you see the list, and 1.6, the yield potential. You'll notice here the items in the green: yield potentials, herbicide resistant traits, disease resistance. Those were the 3 that ranked at the top, with yield potential being by far and away the number one reason. So these individual producers were picking based on yield potential. The item that ranked toward the bottom was the price of the seed. So these individuals focused on the yield potential of the varieties, and seed was, if you might call it, a secondary item, but they were very much concerned with getting the yield potential in those seeds. One producer ranked the company with elite genetics as the most important reason for going there or using that seed. So anyway, we continued to see a focus on yield potential on those soybeans. All planted at least majority, and again, this is Central Illinois, Group 3 maturities. 4 producers planted some or all seed beans. 2 planted some or all non-GMO beans. And that trend, by the way, was more prevalent earlier in the time period. 8 planted some or all Roundup Ready to Extend, and all did some pre-emergence and post-emergence post-emergence seed control. 4 applied a separate fertilizer application prior to soybean planting. 6 of the producers, and now we're moving to in-season practices. 6 producers routinely scouted fields themselves, and 6 completely and again or partially applied fungicides, and 5 included an insecticide with that applications. And again, the reasons given for the fungicide application included yield gain, disease and insect control, and that being a normal practice. All did grid sampling. 8 used VRT for fertilizer, and 9. Here you see a difference between VRT on fertilizer and lime, and that between seed. Seed, we didn't see much use of variable seeding rate technology. Here, fertilizer and done were done variable rate. Harvesting practices. Harvesting soybean obviously was dependent on weather and crop conditions. 2 started all soybeans after corn was finished. 3 stopped harvesting when moisture levels were too low, and there was a lot of use of draper heads. relatively recent technology, but 8 were using draper heads. 61% of the soybeans were stored commercially. 81% of the corn was stored commercially. The important thing about that latter point is that we did not see, if anything, we probably saw more use of non-GMO and seed beans. And if you look at commercial storage, it's pretty typical of all farms in Illinois. 2 producers had planted soybeans for soybeans. For those that didn't, the reasons that were given was that including changing rotation, reconfiguring of fields, late spring, or economics. Soybeans after rotations were fairly fixed on these operations. Third point here, forward pricing and cash markets were the most common methods of marketing. They weren't, in general, doing much different. They were using standard forward pricing and cash markets. They weren't doing anything a lot different on the marketing side. A third of them used some sort of hedging using forward or futures contracts and some options. The seed bean contracts were able to sell percentages of those crops over time. Where they got their information, seed and chemical representatives, 8 were from university specialist and extension, and then you can see some of the other lists there, but 9 seed and chemical representatives were listed as the #1 source of agronomic information. We asked about comparison shopping between fertilizers and pesticides. 4 of them said yes, 2 said no, and 3 said sometimes. In the last 5 years, how many different sources have been used to purchase fertilizers and seed? 3 used 1 supplier, 5 used 2, and 1 used 3. A couple of those that used more than 1 fertilizer and pesticides supplier did so because of the area and getting a fertilizer and seed pesticide supplier closer to that or to each part of their farm. We asked, did they do comparisons of shopping for seed? 4 yes, 3 no, and 2 sometimes. It's sort of interesting that even the 3 no's somehow got lower seed cost on a per acre basis. In the last 5 years, how many different sources have you purchased seed from? 3 used 2 suppliers, 2 used 3, 1 used 4, and 3 used 5. But so you can see seed suppliers typically were more seed suppliers, as you would probably expect, than fertilizer and pesticides. On the attitudinal side, 8 strove for the most profitable yields as compared to the highest yields. In terms of risk management, all took out crop insurance at least at 75% or greater levels. One of the things that we do see pretty much across Illinois is that crop insurance is used pretty much on all commercial farms at a fairly high level. 5 took hail insurance and 4 subscribed to marketing advisory services. On the marketing advisory services, they subscribed to it and may have not followed all of their marketing advice. 8 of the 9 felt that their machinery was size complete was correctly. 6 of the 9 divided their management functions among various family members. 2 were the only operators, so they had to handle all of their management functions. We gave a list of factors that in managing the farm and asked them to rank those from 1 being the most important and 8 being the least important. Here you see that list, and the lower numbers would be the ones that they thought were most important. You can see here, attention to detail, operating cost management, and disciplined spending tended to rank high, as well as maximizing yields. So these operators felt like attention to detail, operating cost management, disciplined spending were very important. Somewhat interesting is that last item there, implement new technologies was the lowest one. They didn't view that as that important of a factor. The detailed cost management and discipline spending were much higher rated than implementing new technologies. Generally, takeaways from this part of the study was typically had typical production practices. We did see, number 2 here, create additional value. 6 of the 9 raised seed beans, non-GMO. We saw a movement towards earlier planting, and seeding rates have been reduced and all using some sort of seed treatment. So you saw these individual farmers doing the typical type things or adopting some of the newer technologies. Seed selection was based on yield potential, herbicide use, and disease resistance. As compared, those were more important than the cost. They were using typical marketing and risk management strategies. Typically, we're using newer technologies and production practices, and not on the bleeding edge. Typically, we're adopting those early, but may not have been the first or most important here. Latter point, attention to detail and cost control were very important. All of these operations did put a high regard to cost control. So those parts of the study led to our 7 points of 7 habits of financially resilient farmers. And here's how we would summarize what we saw with those groups. Again, we were looking at farms, identifying those from more profitable and less profitable. We then went out and did some surveys with the more profitable farms. Again, those surveys were small in nature, but pretty informative as well. Here's our 7 habits. We found those producers to be innovative, but not on the bleeding edge of technology. They tended to be early adopters, maybe not the first adopters of those technologies. Number 2, and this came through more with just talking to them, is that they were always evaluating new technologies. So they were always looking for items that would increase the profitability of the farm, and that led to number 3, that returns was the important evaluation criteria. That yield, well, getting higher yields was important. You did have to look at the cost associated with those and make sure that those costs covered those new technologies. Again, we did see that these operations had higher yields, and again, over the time period, we saw both higher corn and soybean yields on these farms. So they were getting higher yields, but to a person, they put profitability or evaluating those technologies in terms of profitability as being more important. 7 habits, 4 through 7. Cost control is paramount. Again, we saw a lot of emphasis on cost control. Again, that, if anything, has become more important in the recent time period after our prices have declined. We saw cost control is what is becoming more and more important in separating those farms. Production, number 5, is maintained at high levels. And it's sort of interesting. Number 1, cost control. We did not see these operations paying more for seed or fertilizer or pesticides per acre. In fact, we saw a little bit less on seed and fertilizer. Not a lot, a little bit less. At the same time, they paid less for those inputs. Production was still maintained at high levels. So, they weren't paying more for the inputs and getting that higher production. Number 6, that brought the right expertise to the farms. And again, a lot of them had divided their management functions on those farms, and there's tended to be a consultant involved in those operations, whether it was a marketing consultant, production, agronomic consultant. There wasn't anything you could say that there wasn't one type of consultant that predominated, but they did tend to bring in expertise. Now, I would attribute that to bringing in expertise, perhaps where they felt that they needed to bring in that expertise on the farm. 7, non-timing price opportunities are sought, and all of these, or many of the farms had either non-GMO contracts in the past or seed bean contracts in the past. We saw them getting higher prices. A lot of that was due to non-GMO seed bean contracts. It's important to also realize they didn't do anything out of the ordinary on their marketing side. So they weren't doing, you couldn't look at them and say that this one area was more, they didn't use hedging contracts any more than another alternative. In what we took away from this was that we had very good production managers that did it still at lower cost than those other managers. And again, those were how we, with the 7 habits, again, would be how we would summarize how we would look at those operations. Again, we will be going and we'll be looking more at these, or having a session on these 7 habits at these upcoming sessions here. We'll also talk at those about crop insurance, marketing, getting the most out of your production inputs, and we'll also have sessions on cash flow management, which is the key to cost control. I appreciate your time today. We thank you for being here, and I would answer any questions that may have arisen. Thanks for being in a cold morning here in central Illinois, probably all of Illinois for that matter.
Okay. Thank you, Gary, for your presentation. Very interesting. For those of you that might be coming down to the Illinois Soybean Summit next week, next Thursday, and at the Windham Center over in Springfield, Gary will be giving a presentation probably very similar to this one. And I look forward to listening to it again, Gary, to even learn more. Got some questions, Gary, and I want to start off with this whole thing about the power cost, the lower power cost. And you pointed that out in one of your early data slides and tables. And I'd like you to elaborate how growers can, save on power costs. What are these things that growers can do to make them more profitable, considering the high cost of machinery today and so forth?
Yeah, that is a very good question. And a power cost in this is related primarily to machinery. And machinery cost is where that is related to. One point I would make: all the farms between 2006 through 2014, including our high profit groups, purchased machinery, and they did purchase more machinery than they did prior to that, due to higher incomes and the tax advantages associated with that. Our high profit farms did purchase more machinery, but they purchased less than other groups, so they did it less than the other groups. What we see, though, when we look at those high profit farms, the number one thing that usually separates, first item that separates the groups is the harvesting cost, and really focusing on getting the combined sized for the type of farm or the size of farm that we're looking at. The second thing you look at then is the number of tractors, and I'm not talking about 20-year-old tractors, but newer, higher priced tractors. And 3 versus 2 does make a big difference on power cost. Somewhat surprisingly, when we're looking at it, we do see a number of these farms doing differences or having 2 planters. So it's not necessarily having a less planter, but typically if they have 1 or 2 planters, one of them is relatively new and one of them is older. And this group that had the older ones typically used the older planter for the soybeans. I'm not saying that that's the way it should be, but that's the way they did it. So really sizing the complement for the farm size and looking whether at those power units is really, really key.
Okay, some more questions. A few questions. Are additional inputs such as high-end seed treatments, foliar fungicides, and foliar nutrient applications, are they worth their investment at this current commodity price point, current price point?
All right, so, and Dan, maybe you can put in your 2 cents worth here as well. You probably have a pretty good feel from this from a agronomic standpoint. What we did see was it's important to realize that all our farmers were using some sort of seed treatment. Still, though, they were not getting their seed costs weren't where we would put those seed treatments, were not higher than the other groups. On the fungicide side, so seed treatments that get the plant up and going, these farmers would say yes. Fungicide side wise, you would want to be looking at that, in my opinion, more from a preventative standpoint rather than looking at it as simple as something that you do. And again, you got to realize we are now looking at lower prices than we were past couple of years. So you got to get in a lower price environment. You do have to get more of a yield response to make those practices pay.
We're going to talk about this at the Resilient Farm Roadshow. We're going to have a session a little bit on return on investment. And right, Gary, these technologies, these practices of seed treatments, fungicides, and foliar feeding, all these things can make you money or lose you money. It all relates back to the kind of systems approach you take as well. But we're going to dive into that more on these roadshow events this next month. Let's go back to some more questions here. What percentage of the farmers do you consider financially resilient? I suppose that's within that database that set the FBFM 6,000 farmers. What percent you consider resilient, financially resilient?
All right, so that's another very good question. Let me start by saying that I'm going to start by saying that I do not think that we're going to see a large number of defaults or large financial problems that cause operations to exit the industry immediately in the next year or so. And I wouldn't necessarily call that financial resilience, but we have a lot of farms out there that have some cash flow problems, but still have good amounts of working capital and equity on their balance sheets, and they're going to be able to survive for quite a while. If you're looking at farms that are going to cash flow positive and build net worth, that they're much fewer. And looking at those, it would be more, in that group, it would be closer to the top third to maybe 40 to 50%. So while we're not going to see, and those farms would be building net worth and still pushing their financial position forward, but there's quite a few farms that are just hanging on, and I wouldn't necessarily describe those as financially resilient, but they're not going to be forced out of business because they've made a lot of good decisions in the past. But this price environment isn't one where if you're paying high cost that you're going to be building net worth.
Right. Yes. Another question. Can you explain the considerable cost and revenue difference between the Central Illinois group and the Northern Illinois group?
So some of that is due to just the yields, but one of the things that we do see is that Northern Illinois farms typically have a higher cost. And if you're looking at Northern Illinois, there's a couple reasons for that. One is that we typically see machinery complements bigger for a given farm size than in Central Illinois. The second thing is if you're looking at drying and storage, in particular drying on corn, those costs typically tend to be higher. We also see in Northern Illinois, for a number of reasons, more corn grown than soybeans. So Northern Illinois farms typically ran higher corn rotations and soybean rotations, and corn has higher costs than soybeans. So those sort of factors lead to higher cost for Northern Illinois farms compared to Central Illinois farms.
Okay. What is beans on beans the way to go in 2018?
So here, I'll give you two answers to that. My guess is that our high profit farms are not going to do a lot of beans on beans, that they have a rotation and they're going to stick to it. If you're looking at budgets, beans on beans, if you look at our budgets, beans on beans will compete with corn after corn. And it's going to do that as long as we have $9.50 and above soybean prices and below $4 corn prices. Right now, the soybean to corn price ratio favors soybeans, and it has for the last several years. And we're going to see that until we see some sort of price change. So soybeans after soybeans will compete with corn after soybeans, and that's under the assumption that there's no, production problem on a field. There's no cyst nematode or some other known production problem that you're just going to do soybeans after soybeans on a field that we don't think we have a soybean production problem.
Okay. In your data, in your surveys, do you have an idea how many of the growers apply fungicides all the time versus only some of the time?
Yeah, we do. Yeah, we do. And again, we got some of the ones that we do right now, and I can't give you that number right now, but I could get that number and tell you that. So we do know that from the surveys that we've done.
I'll come back to you on that one, Gary, in a minute, because this came from an individual. We probably can answer that. The other question they asked, for those that did more scouting, did they spray more or less?
I don't know that answer. That's a good one. We didn't. I'm not sure we asked that question. Well, we could look at it and see if we can see some sort of correlation. We did not look at that. That's a good question.
I'm going to go back and see if I can get the email to that individual and send it to you. And that's they're from the same individual, so maybe you could respond to that.
Yeah.
What about, is there a relationship between renting, the amount of land you rent, and profitability? Is there a relationship between the amount of land you rent on your farm and profitability?
Not necessarily. And again, when we get, particularly when we look at these FBFM farms, by the way, when we looked at these profitability farms, we explicitly tried not to account for that. So what we see on our farms in FBFM, and this would be true of most farms, if you look at anything over 1,000 acres and particularly over 2,000 acres, the typical amount of farmland that they own is between 10 and 20% of the land base. And if they have more than that, they will be more profitable because they typically also, if they own more of their land, they don't owe a lot of debt. What on that land? That's just one of the things we also observe. It's not so much renting land that causes profitability differences. It's renting land at high cash rents. And cash rents, vary a lot within a very small area. If I go to a county and, picked two parcels of land right next to each other, same farmland productivity, there could be different. Farms that have the most problems in the future or right now are those farms that have 90% or more of their land cash rented and have it at a average to above average cash rent. Those individuals are going to have difficulties cash flowing. So it's sort of the combination of high amounts of cash rent, which most farms have, but then also having high cash rents.
Right. Okay. Well, Gary, we've reached the end of our hour. Again, I want to thank Dr. Gary Schnitkey, University of Illinois, for speaking today. Thank you very much. Again, we will be having these Resilient Farm Roadshows coming up in February, and you're invited to log on to the website and register to attend at those locations. And Gary also will be speaking next week at Illinois Soybean Summit in Springfield. You can Google 2018 Soybean Summit, and you'll find the website, and you can register to attend. It's free, and you can register at the door. Again, if you listen to this as a CCA, if you listen to this webinar today, and you sort of stayed through the entirety, your CCA number will be submitted, and you'll get credit in professional development, which we all need, some of those hours. And if you listen to the recording of this webinar, you'll need to go back into your CCA account and self-apply for one CEU. Again, on behalf of the Illinois Soybean Association and the Also Advisor Soybean Manager website, I want to thank you all for participating today in this webinar, and this webinar is now over.